The first 3 weeks of the eruption here in Hawaii, crazy things would happen in the middle of the night. A new fissure would open up and it would threaten a new neighborhood. Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. I started the Hawaii Tracker Facebook group to help people understand what's going on and get their questions answered.
Hey, how's it going? We're live. This is Fissure 20.
We had hundreds of people all throughout the neighborhoods sending in videos, articles, and images. We spend a lot of time making sure the accurate information gets out.
This is live. There's still lava moving.
They weren't just sharing a story, they were helping their neighbor. If a family was being evacuated, the group would just jump in and help out. So it was huge. They were watching out for each other.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you for the support from everybody.
As we go through this, we're growing closer together as a community. When tragedies like this strike, you really realize how much you need each other.
Hello everyone, I'm geologist Philip Ong, here with Mr. Dane DuPont from HVERI, the Hawaiian Volcano Education and Resilience Institute. Today is Thursday, May 30th, 2024. No eruption on the surface, no lava on the surface for a long time, Dane, but still some rumblings underground, a little bit different this week than in the past weeks. So we'll get into that, but first of all, how are you doing, man? How are you today?
Yeah, doing pretty good, with nothing really going on from the volcano to really the weather. It's been kind of quiet, so we've been focusing on a lot of preparation and trying to prepare for the next disaster recently and come together with a couple of events that we're participating in, including one this Saturday that I think we'll talk about a little later.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the work never ends, right? It's always talking about what's happened in the past, preparing for what happen in the future, and then all together lifting all of our boats at the same time, right? Bringing all of our level up so we can all handle better. Network and all of that we've talked about in the past. So yeah, we'll get into the events a little later on. It turns out that there are a few anniversaries happening right around this time as well. Of course, there was 2018. Where this was a really eventful week in 2018, so we'll do some volcano awareness today with a cut from your Jones On series about that. That last week of May was a lot of stuff happened that week, including Hell Night, reactivation of Ahu'ela'au Fissure 8, the lava making its turn towards Kapoho, lots of stuff all within that 1 week that we'll review on the back half of our show today. But we'll also talk about an anniversary, which is the May 31st, 1954 eruption, which only lasted 3.5 days. But really, that's a little generous. It really lasted one morning, honestly, before it fizzled out and tailed off for a few days after that. So we'll talk about that briefly. And we won't talk about, we've covered it in the past though, but it's also the anniversary of the 1840 Lower East Rift flow, the one that Nana Valley Estates is currently built on down there. That made the sand hills along the beach road down there. So that's just end of May. And then coming up, beginning of June, Mauna Loa 1950, huh, Dane?
Yeah.
The biggest eruption, fastest moving, most rivers of lava to the ocean, all the records for lots of things.
Right. Pretty devastating eruption, especially if you think about it in modern times, because it was devastating back then, but the island was significantly less populated than it is now, especially in some of the more exposed regions. No lava flow is exactly the same, but you could see that volume and that vigor, what it could be, what the potential there is for it to do.
Yeah, for sure. So that's why we keep preparing and keep doing all that other stuff. So we'll get into all that. But first, to start off, we'll get into our Hawaiian volcano summary. But before I do that, just remind everyone that Dane will lead the discussion in the chat, take questions for us to discuss partway through before we get into the 2018 recap. And anything else, Dane?
No, I think that's it. Make sure to like and subscribe, all that fun jazz.
All right. So let's get ready for our summary here. And rearrange our screen. All right. The Hawaiian volcano summary for this week. Earthquake rates are down on Kilauea, as you see here on this graph, from the previous few weeks. But activity has continued in a different form with these low frequency pulses of energy. They're long period earthquakes that you see a few of here tailing off a couple of days ago. And this indicates continued magma movement within a volcano, according to the USGS HVO. As far as the detected earthquakes, which often do not register those long period signals, most of the events are around the main caldera, around Halema'uma'u, and a little bit down on that east side of the Koaʻe along the upper East Rift Zone or East Rift Connector. So it's a little slower than last week, but with the still ongoing background events still happening in the south flank and down in Pahala. It's colored by depth here. Looking at the ground tilt at the Sand Hill Station, this is the last month. So over the last week, we've had a deflation and inflation cycle here. And currently, both the South Caldera and the main caldera areas appear to be inflating on that trend. However, if we look at the caldera length, north and south, the measure of that width of the caldera, it has varied quite a bit here, where it's been expanding very quickly and then contracting and then expanding and now contracting. And this likely is reflecting the pulse of magma that are moving through that main caldera area and then south into that Koaʻe Fault Zone, which is still showing uplift and inflation as well. So that's the story on Kilauea. That pattern's continued since October. The volcano's been able to adjust through intrusion in the southwest rift, ground and uplift as well. And so we'll wait to see if this does lead to some new chapter, such as an eruption, or whether the volcano can continue to adjust through these underground movements. That's Kilauea. Mauna Loa, it's still quiet. Here are the earthquakes colored by depth over the last month. Not too many, about 60 on there, which is background. And if we look at its caldera distance, north to south, across Mokua Veil, you can see here at the far right end that there's some variation, but it also has continued overall to expand, right? Showing the sides of the crater are moving apart from each other because magma is coming into there and filling and pressurizing the area. So it seems to move apart sideways. Occasionally it drops down a little bit before it pops back up. It's doing that little wiggle there as well, similar to what we're seeing on Kilauea. And that's our Hawaiian volcano summary for this week. So we'll get into our hazard summary, which is the gas. When there is no lava coming out, the gases are the main hazard to people. And the volume is quite low still, around 60 tons per day, which for the volcano is pretty low, but it's enough that people who are nearby who are sensitive may have issues. So this is a national park air quality map, and you can see that all the near summit stations are showing green. So the air has been pretty good. The VOG map measurement and predicting project, VMAP, also puts out their forecast. And here it is, with very little gas coming out from the volcano. You hardly see any effect. If I change the color scale here, you can see a little bit where it might be moving in low concentrations that do not cause issues for most people. So good news on the gas still now. And just a quick pause. I was just driving through Mountain View the other day and reminiscing on how much VOG we used to have constantly from Pu'u'o before the summit crater opened up, and then from Hale as well. And so really it's kind of a golden era right now of how little gas the volcano is putting out, and just putting it out in pulses once in a while. So overall, long-term big picture, the gas conditions on the island are as good as we've seen in quite a while. So we'll move on to some visual observations. And to do that, we'll go to the live webcams from USGS from a few minutes ago when the sun was shining on the crater floor. This is that KW camera showing that wide view with that area of mineral buildup around that central core of a crusted lava lake here. Otherwise, the thermal camera is showing no unusual heat signatures coming from beneath that crust. Our live V1 camera gives us a little bit of resolution of that central core zone, still degassing and building up minerals. We went through the time lapses last week of how these minerals have built up over the last few months and how the crater bulged in this area back over here as magma pulsed through in early October. But today we'll just move through the regular views and give you a little extra on a historical awareness context. So nice views going across. Here's that downdrop block. Looking at these most recent fissures from September of 2023. We'll come back to this later. You can see that part of the lava flow that's up in this easternmost part of this bench. There was one that came off of the crack on a crater wall up here and it trickled down. We'll talk about that later as well. Otherwise, here's a view from the B1 camera to the south. These are the cracks that we saw widening through that pulse in October, but have been static in their width ever since. It's still worth tracking here. And otherwise, you start seeing a little rainbow as the rain starts drifting in over the crater here. A little bit of weather coming in here at the summit of Kilauea. So those are our visual observations. With that, we'll turn to our monitoring and get to the biggest news of the week here, which is just recapping this onset of low-frequency earthquakes that the USGS has put out. So to do this, we'll go through highlighting some of the phrases from the daily updates. So going back to last Saturday, looking at the daily updates, at that point in time, there was no unusual mention of low-frequency earthquakes in the update. There were background levels of earthquakes in an area, Upper East Rift Zone and South Caldera, which that day meant less than 30 earthquakes detected. And so we'll keep it simple at that. And we'll move on to Sunday when we have a change in the update here. They say, over the past day, all the rates were at background levels until 7:30 a.m. Less than 30 earthquakes were detected, but at approximately 7:30 a.m., the rates beneath the summit increased with the onset of low-frequency energy pulses, as they say here. So they say deformation and minor inflation deflation continued, but that was the onset there on Sunday morning. And then if we just peruse here through Monday, they note the number of individual earthquakes remain low with less than 20 events, but that heightened seismic unrest continued, primarily in the form of low frequency energy signals, typical of magma movement. So that's what we're seeing there, is that pulsing. And coming to Tuesday, we see a similar description again, less than 10 actual events, but still with low frequency energy signals. And the same in yesterday's update, same text there. Yeah, they only say few events detected, doesn't even give a number there. And then coming to today, it changes a little bit back, where we no longer have a mention of the low frequency earthquakes, and we're now back to about 40 earthquakes in the summit region. So they mentioned that 30 was around the background, so we're just barely over the background. It's not huge numbers of earthquakes, but that's the way that the activity has been changing. It's been changing in the actual way, the way that energy has been released. Instead of having lots of discrete detectable earthquakes, you have these low frequency pulses that are basically a vibration of some crack somewhere as magma is flowing through it and causing that harmonic vibration there. So that's the updates, and we can go to the data. Looking at the last week on Kilauea Summit, there is our inflation, deflation, inflation signal. We're fairly zoomed in here. And over that time, the earthquake counts have not varied very much. And this is measuring that whole map area rather than just Kilauea Summit. So the counts are slightly higher, but proportional to activity in the summit there. And there's depth versus time. So we've seen this plot be a big smear of color, and now you actually can see discrete gaps and small little pulses of events, like one that came on here in the last day, but fairly low numbers and frequency compared to what we saw previously for most of earlier in May and most of April as well. So there's our 1 week map that we've just discussed. So I'll just keep moving on from there. And in cross section, what that looks like. And this is a really big scale, so we usually like to zoom in a lot more into this little zone, but this helps you understand what the colors mean on the map above, as far as the depth versus longitude. So over the last month, we have a bigger context of the pattern of change on Kilauea. Clearly, it's a long-term inflation here, where we're starting off at nearly negative 15 microradians and ending somewhere, I don't know, 12, 13, something like that. So you're looking at more than 25 microradians of tilt over the month, which is a good pace there. It's not alarming, but it is steadily still just revving up there. And you see the superimposed deflation inflation cycles superimposed upon that. And since I haven't mentioned it in a while, those are thought to be some circulation of magma within the uppermost reservoir plumbing system as gas poor denser magma tries to flush out of the system, and it blocks the fresher stuff coming up through some small gap. And once it flushes out, then it's replaced with that fresher gassy stuff that's hotter, that then retilts the volcano back to its normal baseline there. And so it kind of deflates as it flushes out and reinflates and something like that. So it's just some circulation pattern of the magma in that uppermost reservoir system, we believe. So looking past that, the overall signal is one of inflation here at this area southeast of Uekahuna, which normally is Hale-Ma'uma'u, but may also mean that area further south to the Koaʻe. So the Sand Hill Station is useful because it helps us untangle those signals from the South Caldera in green and Hale-Ma'uma'u. And sometimes these deviate a little bit or show different magnitudes of change, such as we saw earlier in May. But right now they seem to be well in sync in a steady deflation inflation cycle together. All right, so that makes sense if the pathways are open and magma is actually flowing through the system to cause these low frequency earthquakes without all the major earthquakes that color our maps. So there's our last month of earthquakes, depth versus time. And you can see the much more intense activity in these pulses earlier in a month compared to what we have going on within the last week now. And this is how we usually see it, where all those colored dots get stacked up and you just see it as a bar graph. And even still, you see that here we are pretty low, right? And we did note last week how these cycles of higher counts of earthquakes were decreasing in their length and their duration. They were getting shorter and shorter. And here it seems like we've broken a pattern now. And we'll just wait to see what comes next. In the big picture for earthquakes per week over the last year, we had our big intrusion in the Southwest Rift in end of January, early February. We just had our most recent seismic crisis, we'll call it, here in the Koaʻe zone, and there it is. And so we're basically coming down off of that once again. So for the last 5 years, you can see the pattern has been steadily rising. Right? So this goes back to October last year, somewhere right in here. We're following the eruption in June and September. We had higher earthquake counts, and now the background seems to be coming up, apart from following the last Southwest Rift pulse that occurred here in late February. And here's a recovery in March. So that's all the signals. The only thing I want to point out additionally here on our GPS is just to know how our pattern has changed. You see, looking back to about a year ago, when we had just come off of the eruption in June, building to the eruption in September, right in here, how our rate of extension of the caldera north and south in Kilauea was pretty steady. Sometimes it would wiggle a little bit, but overall, a little faster. Here's a little wiggle right in there. But overall, it was fairly steady coming upwards. We have that eruption occurs in September. We actually don't change much off of our baseline. That deviation only lasts a few days there. Because if you would just continue this trend, you would have just kept going right here, right? So that eruption didn't really accomplish much in the long term as far as relieving that pressure, where it kept going. And then October, right in here, is when we start having the intrusion into the Southwest Rift, and eventually the Koaʻe as well. And now we start seeing this wiggle pattern, where it seems like you see it expanding, contracting, wiggling up, or more steady, up and down, and that more wiggly pattern there continues all the way to, this is the intrusion, end of January, early February, right there. And then once that happens, it starts off going a little more steady up at different rates. And then more recently, here we are back to the wiggly up, extending, contracting, extending, contracting, extending, contracting. Almost like it's a loose tooth. A kid's got a loose tooth, but falling. It wiggles one way and wiggles the other way. It's just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. That's a chunk south of the caldera. That's between the Koaʻe and the main caldera. And if it moves to the north, because the Koaʻe is swelling, then it makes the length contract. And if it's moving to the south, because the Magma area is expanding, then it makes it expand. So that might be why you see this kind of wiggling back and forth. And overall, the baseline is still extending overall, right? That's important to note. So that is the GPS at the summit. And on the rift zone at Pu'o'o, we've seen some of this data, not just show the true range of the noise, but show that steady trend of contraction still happening on a lower east rift, middle east rift here, actually. All right, so that's our most of our data. I thought we could look a little bit more to seismographs, and as noted, most of the earthquakes in the last day have not been low frequency, but there is still a little bit from a couple of days ago that shows up in this 24 or 48-hour seismograph here. And there is a lot of other noise. Sometimes you have to filter through what's daytime, what's nighttime, where there's like helicopters flying by. And so I thought in this case I would show you 3 side-by-side signals here from the summit region, so that you can tell more so what might be regional patterns or what's localized to one station, which is more likely noise. So yeah, there is overall, this is 7 a.m. there and at 7 p.m. there, more or less in there. So there usually is more activity in the daytime from people and cars and all that. So you do see that pattern, but embedded within that pattern is where you see these longer bands that look something like this. Right? They're lasting several minutes, potentially. The scale on the bottom is 15 minutes across the bottom here. So about that far is 1 minute. Right? So when we're seeing some of these events lasting two minutes maybe, or 3 minutes perhaps, just vibrating as magma is flowing through some narrow part of the conduit there. Yeah, so some stations pick it up a little more cleanly, and this maybe isn't the best example, but this is what I have to show right now without getting too down a rabbit hole on other kinds of signals or graphs or anything like that. So we'll leave it at that, and we'll keep going. Move on now to looking at the most recent INSAR image. So this is coming from the Mounts project here, and the most recent image looks like this. So this was released on May 27th. It's a 12-day window, once again, from the 15th to the 27th. Line of sight this direction with the satellite moving in that direction while it's doing its capture there. So we've seen there's some differences depending on the angle and the computation, but overall we can compare these images from week to week. So this week, the center is somewhere right in here, right along the South Caldera rim, more or less, pretty close to this Koaʻe area. And it looks like it might be around in the blue, purple-blue color range, something like that. So I might have, from purple-blue, maybe one ring of inflation happening here, which in this case is about 2.8 centimeters, as it's showing here. So that's the last 12 days. So I'll go back to the 12 days before that. And there it is. So in that snapshot, the inflation center was more under the inner caldera by Hale. And in that case, our peak was about this pinkish purple, and we can have clear side of 1 and 2 different bands, right? So twice as much movement of the ground over the previous 2 weeks as this most recent last 2 weeks. And going back even further from that window to look between May 3rd and the 21st of April, that's when we had that big pulse in the Koaʻe, which actually looks like the peak might be somewhere in the green. So it might be 1, 2, 3 rings of swelling of the ground there, and back in the south. So this is what I mean by having this piece of ground. If you're this piece of ground, instruments are right in here, and inflation is south of you, and then it's north of you, and then it's south of you. And that could be what makes your GPS signal be wiggling back and forth like that. And just for reference, there is that big pulse at the end of April. And for comparison, the USGS annotated image, which does show that inflation center a little bit further off to the west. So just keep that in mind, that there are different calculations, and that automatic one maybe isn't going to be consistent, but it's still useful for a first pass for us to understand what the volcano is doing with this automated calculation. So we do appreciate the Mountains project. So that's the monitoring, and we'll finish off Kilauea by looking at our earthquakes. So recent earthquakes colored by depth here for the last 2 weeks. You see a lot of this background pattern across the island, Deep Pahala earthquakes, and Kilauea is showing still that most recent flare-up that it had. So if I zoom in to Kilauea a little more closely here, and switch us to the last 2 days, you'll see this change to just right around that lava lake. Hardened lava lake is where the most recent activity happens to be. So we've said in the past that even with all this adjustment happening south of the crater, it still seems the most likely place when pressure builds up that this pops out of the ground is still at Magma at the summit. There are some other zones of weakness developing as well, but that's still the most likely of all the choices that are in play here. So we'll come back to that later as well. But first, let's check out earthquakes by size and plotted by time here, with the most recent ones shown in red, so you're not really seeing many. Let's put it newest first, and you'll see oranges here in the last couple hours, yellow, or the last couple of days, I should say, and the yellows in the last couple of weeks here, last week. So there is one I wanted to highlight that's out here. That's a 3.2. It's actually the largest one this past week as well. About 10 miles down. This is another just adjustment of the whole seafloor that surrounds the Hawaiian Islands. And so just worth knowing that when you see those kind of events out there, that's what's normal. 3-somethings. It's nothing to really be concerned about. So coming closer in here to Kilauea, within this frame of view, the largest earthquake was a 2.9 here in the south flank. So this is that south flank, just south of Pool area, moving as it normally does as part of the background, right? So eventually this is going to keep moving and allow magma to reestablish this Middle East rift somewhere in there, perhaps, someday. And this is just part of that background movement that keeps occurring for that to occur, for that to happen. So that's the biggest one. Nothing else is really worth highlighting for the earthquakes. So we'll move on from that to Mauna Loa. And Mauna Loa, as we've mentioned, has been just as quiet recently. Here's the signals for the last week of the tilt. There's our regular daily ups and downs with no huge pattern otherwise. Very few earthquakes, all fairly shallow. The longer term tilt showing some cyclicity that perhaps might be due to tidal variations, but also might be influenced by the flank movement of Mauna Loa in response to all this Kilauea adjustment happening just below it. Right? I've in the past heard Kilauea described like a doorstop to Mauna Loa. Right? If the doorstop moves a little bit, then the door can swing open a little more and move back and forth. And there's a little bit of that dynamic happening between Kilauea being Mauna Loa's south flank and Mauna Loa expanding and its flank moving as well. So rates over the last month, earthquakes per day have not exceeded 5, so still very low earthquake counts. All this very low compared to the deep earthquake pulse we saw in the end of 2023, and very low compared to the build-up to 2022 eruption. So that's most of Mauna Loa. I can highlight this week's Volcano Watch as well, which is also about Mauna Loa. They've authored this article, Beyond the Lava, Mauna Loa's Deformation Story. And this is something we've covered before. I don't have the graph up here just because I figure this is their storytelling. And here they are showing how they conduct GPS surveys across Kilauea and Mauna Loa to help understand the changes of the volcano, both volcanoes there. So they actually go through here and compare 75, 84, and 2022, and how earthquakes ramped up, how deformation increased. And since we've gone through all of that with all the data before, I won't get into all of it in detail here again. But Volcano Watch is recapping all of those events, right? And my takeaway of the whole thing is that there's a lot more data nowadays with our better instrumentation. And so it's hard to compare what we're seeing now to really even 75, because the amount of data is just different, the quality of data is different, and it's hard to know if there's any patterns with that few data points as well. Right, so great to see these repeated surveys going on, and I'll look forward to a little bit more technical presentation on the actual updated graph of the extension across the summit compared to 75 and 84 too. So that's Volcano Watch this week. And I thought before we take our break, we'll do the first part of our volcano awareness presentation, which this week will be the 1954 eruption. So let me just start off by saying so this is a colorized image with CapCut of 1954 May 31st eruption at Hale-Ma'uma'u. So this is from the National Park Archive. What you're seeing here is a fissure that is across the floor of Hale that you can see half of the crater floor, with one tall fountain that was actually bursting above the rim of Hale by 100 to 200 feet. And the fissure that had crossed across this crater floor here flooded the whole inner crater with lava. But the crack also propagated to feed a fissure up here in the top side. And that fissure had a series of cracks through which lava was actually leaking out of a little hole of one right above that fountain and cascading down into the inner crater in this lava falls. So let's see if I can zoom this in a little more so you guys to see. There's that little trickle of lava right there, the high fountain. You see some churning in here. And if I come up to the side, you can see that fissure above the crater rim. So the fissure was cutting across this 3D structure, as would happen later in 1982 and happened in 1974 in Kanakako'i crater. But fairly rare thing to see, and this is what made this eruption most visually unique, was this feature right in here with this crack that wasn't actually even fountaining lava, it was just leaking lava out and tumbling it down into this growing lava lake below. So we'll do a little bit of a slideshow to start. Here's a different, more zoomed in view you can see. Slightly colorized as well, but for the most part just showing how much gas is escaping from this eruption. You can see that once again here. There's that inner crater of Hale. We're looking to the southwest here from Volcano House area, more or less. You know, a fissure coming across on that south side of the main caldera floor and feeding lava flow on that main caldera floor for the first time in 30 years at this point in the 1950s. So that's how it looked. And there's a couple images from Jerry Eden from the USGS that are actually in their distributed colorized like this already. I'm not sure how this was colorized. But here you see that lava lake within the pit with its big bubbles as the fountains that were crossing that crater floor that were cutting across what was a 1952 eruption site from 2 years earlier. They started fountaining, fed this lava lake, and then they were drowned, and now you see them as these little upwellings within a fountaining through the lake here with ripples and these curved patterns all around the bubbles. And so you can only imagine the motion of the lake with it turning and the opening of the cracks of the surface crust and the flashing of the lava from below, as we've seen more recently. But I have not yet found a video of the 54 eruption, I should say, to share. So it's maybe someday. Another famous photograph here, colors. You can see that inner crater wall. And here's a big, call it a tear perhaps, in this crusted lava lake where it seems to be overturning and perhaps recycling that darker crust. Gas coming out from these fountains through the lake here in the center. Here's the parking lot with all the vehicles of the time at the Hale overlook. People coming to see the eruption. Let's see if I can read some of these. Let's say Hilo quality cleaners, perhaps, is up here. I'm not sure if anyone else I can read, but there is a trail with some people over here walking off to see the crater, see the lava within the crater. But really, most of the eruption was over in those first few hours. So in those subsequent days, people could see the lava lake overturning and flashing and oozing from its edges. This was that southwest vent within that inner crater, which we'll come to this description shortly as well. But you'd see it fuming and occasionally bursting out some glowing rocks. So that lasted in total for 3.5 days. And after the fact, here is what it looked like. And there is that inner crater floor. I believe that right in here was that old cone from the 52 eruption. So it's essentially all the way covered, but you see this interesting texture of lava over top of it here. And there is that fissure running off towards the east on the main caldera floor there. So back in here, it's hard to see through the cloud and gas, but Kīlauea would be back in this direction, right in there, more or less, to give you some perspective there. So all this area in here was later covered by other eruptions and lava lakes, in particular in the 60s. So there was not much to show for the map of what was down there. It was all covered subsequently. But this area that's outside on the main caldera floor, here's what that looked like on the map with a rim. And so they noted how there were cracks in between this most western active vent above the rim, and there was that active high fountain here at the bottom of the cliff with the ooze up happening right in between there. And so they're really curious about this dynamic and seeing if they could see a crack all the way through, if it was draining through. But it was really interesting to note that they noted that that lava looked like it was not very gassy. It wasn't bursting or sputtering at all. It was just kind of oozing and falling down, in contrast to all the gas bursts from everywhere else on either side of it. And those cracks continued off the flow itself as well in lots of small segments further afield. So we can look at the maps. The USGS released this map following 2018, showing a difference between the pre-collapse and post-collapse aerial views and the map views. And what results from it is this panel down here, which is the new map showing on a downdrop block where all these flows still remain. And the reason this is relevant is because if you look closely, that's where the 54 flow right there still remains. What's left of it was in that location right there. With anything that was in that inner crater, there's maybe one chunk that was in this lower block here that was since been covered, but anything else that was in that inner crater was covered long before this 2018 collapse. So what I thought would be fun to do here is to just quickly come to Google Earth, and I've superimposed that map on there. And there it is, fully colorized. And so let me make it transparent and zoom in and out a little bit so we can see on this most recent image. This is the September 2023 eruption footprint right in there, kind of through there. It goes back through here as well. And through here it gets a little fuzzy, but here's where this is going to help. If I pull this forward and back, you can see that that's this chunk of lava on 54 right there. There's still some of it left, survived over here, thus far in a downdrop block. Let's go over here to this side and do it again. And even though lava did come dribbling down off of the cliff over here and covered part of this, it does appear that there is still some of this 54 lava left somewhere in here underneath all that new lava there and patches around it. So without getting a closer look or seeing a report from the USGS, we'll just leave it undetermined with knowing that there is some possibility here, but it looks like the lava might have actually covered a good amount of 54 lava in this section. So if that is the case, then we're down to just this one little patch of it left right in here. And see there's another patch of 54 right in here, and we pull that back. You can see that looks like it is largely covered by the more recent flow. But hard to tell when it's black on black there. It might take some boots on the ground fact checking to really know. All right, so that's the Google Earth segment there. And so I'll come back to what I'm going to show you guys a few more photographs here, just showing that the sequence. This is from the USGS Bulletin 1061. This is the eruption 54. This is put out by Gordon MacDonald and Jerry Eaton. And so here is a similar view, which was much worse, and I couldn't get this cleaned up in any way that was useful, but there is that inner crater with gas and that fissure on that crater floor. So now we're looking to the southwest In the southwest, there was a fountain as well. That fountain was the second high fountain, not as tall as the one in the northeast, but still fairly high. Did not exceed that crater rim, unlike the one to the northeast. And here you see how that fountain connects through this series of drowned fissures now, all the way to the northeast fountain, which is this one over here. And that's the one that has that little ooze of lava coming from the crack just behind, and a fissure up above with tons of gas. And that's why I didn't show you this picture first, but that's what's being described here in this paper. So these were photographed by Ralph T. Kanamori from Modern Camera Center, Hilo. Seemed to be the first person on scene at 6 o'clock in the morning when the eruption actually began, close to 4 a.m. or so. So looking at from the ground level at the fissures on the caldera floor, and there they are, chain of lava fountains, right there at 6:45 or so, about 75 feet high. And so let me pull this back and show you the title of this: Hawaiian Volcanoes during 1954, Bulletin 1061B. And this goes through a lot of the setup and prequel to the eruption. And what I wanted to do is just read a little bit of the start of this thing, because I think this shares a little bit of the human element here. So let's see if I can find it. It is, here it is, okay. Narrative of the eruption. So they describe how there were lots of earthquakes the night before, from May 30th to 31st, with slight earthquakes, small earthquakes happening. These wakened many persons in the region near Kīlauea caldera. And here it starts getting interesting. Shortly afterwards, McDonald noticed a faint, persistent, low-pitched roaring, almost a felt vibration, rather than a recognizable sound, somewhat resembling the vibration caused by a heavy truck in low gear climbing a distant hill. The sensation continued as long as the observer remained motionless. They noted there was a moderate earthquake, so the earthquakes were building up from 342 to 347, 351, until at 354 there was a strong one, violent enough to dismantle their seismograph. And so they run over to the Whitney Vault, then called the Whitney Laboratory of Seismology, to restore the instrument to operation. Right, 354, the instrument goes down. So they note that the naturalist from National Park, G.H. Rule, was at Halemaumau at 3:30 in the morning, nothing occurring. They reached the seismograph vault at 4:03 p.m. with no sign of glow in the Halemaumau. They restore the seismograph to operation, put a new sheet to start recording at 4:08 a.m. And at 4:09 a.m., they see the harmonic tremor show up on the seismograph immediately. They go outside the vault at approximately 4:10, and they immediately see the bright glow in Halemaumau, reflected in a rising cloud of gas that had reached thus far 2,000 feet. Later on in the day, they report a cloud had up to a 30,000 foot elevation, where it was spreading out like a great mushroom. And it's a pretty exciting start there, and showing you how they were scrambling to and did catch the eruption, but it took a lot of hustle for that to happen. So they then go to the observatory. They go down to Halemaumau. They note that the fountain in the northeast is fountaining 100 feet above the rim of the crater, rising from the crater floor, which is 470 feet down, which means the entire fountain has a height of between 550 and 600 feet. So it's a pretty big fountain shooting up there. Lots of fume. And then they note that the fissure, which originally began entirely confined within the pit, at 427, 3 minutes later, they note that the fissure opens up on the main caldera floor. So one of the rangers actually saw this and saw the lava incandescent welling out gently at first, with little to no fountaining, followed by a gradual increase of the fountains to a height of 50 to 100 feet. So very similar pattern to what we've seen in more recent times. And there it is described once again in the historical record. Because of the fume rising from Halemaʻumaʻu immediately behind the new outbreak, he was unable to tell whether the arrival of lava was preceded by an outburst of fume. So it just tells you how much gas there was all around and how it made things difficult to see around there. So the fountains grow. They end up being 1,400 feet long along that main principal chain, with three other shorter chains active further east and northeast. The lava is filling the pit, making long flows, but eventually it's going to make that giant lava lake. And outside on a caldera floor was starting to spread across the crater floor there. They make it to the rim of the crater at 4:55 a.m. They see the entire crater floor already covered in lava. And they see still the line of fissures parallel to the 52 fissures stretching across, with fountains reaching from a few feet to more than 100 feet high. The fissure bisected the cones left by the 52 eruption, and lava poured from those cones into the surrounding pool. So that's interesting. It's almost like it erupted out of a very similar crack. That's very rare to see as well, but that was noted there too. And yeah, at the southwest end was that southwest fountain that was 250 to 300 feet high. So maybe half as tall as the one in the northeast. So they keep describing how things evolve, but here is one section that's what they describe as the most unique. Possibly the most spectacular feature of the eruption was the cascade of brilliant orange-yellow lava that poured from the fissure 300 feet above the floor in the northeastern wall of the crater. Plunging down a wall, this firefall of incandescent liquid joined the turbulent pool around the base of the northeast fountain. The lava issued at the head of the cascade quietly, with little spattering and no fountaining, as though it were poor in gas. At the base of the cascade, a row of small fountains issued from the eruptive fissure, merging to the south with a big northeast fountain. So then he describes lava lake movement, all the different fountains in there, the geometry and length of all that stuff. And so here he notes, no conspicuous crack was visible on a wall of Halemaʻumaʻu above the head of the cascade or between the rim and the end of the fountain chain to the east. In the latter gap, there were many cracks in a zone about 50 feet wide along the course of the fissure, but none was continuous for more than a few feet or was more than 2 or 3 millimeters wide. So there's a pretty good description of what those cracks might look like. So we can compare them to the activity and cracks we have occurring more recently here today. So that's some descriptions. I won't go through all the details minute by minute here, but lava's filling up 50 feet deep in the crater there. By 7:30 a.m., fountain activity is decreasing both in the pit and on the caldera floor. Between 8 and 9 a.m., the flow on the caldera floor was still advancing slowly, but it was nearly at its end. Between 10 and 11, all the activity was restricted to the northeast and southwest fountains. Many small avalanches occurring in the crater walls, hitting the lava lake and causing a violent splashing of the lava lake. At 1:30, fountains along the central part of the chain northeast become weakly active, throwing sporadic showers as high as 25 feet, but it was brief, as by 4 p.m. all activity was ended except for very few weak flings and weak whistling gas release. Right, so that's mostly what they saw there. They keep seeing small showers of cinders from the throat of the 52 cone, small flows on the edges of the floor the next morning that ceased the following day on June 2nd here. But the northeast flow continued active and was developing into a small lava lake. The lake was about 300 feet long and 100 feet wide and situated on the course of the erupted fissure. So slow circulation in it from east to west was what was happening. So the lava was coming up and then circulating back down into the crack, and just one small little pond area of that entire floor was what was active for the longest, with no primary fountaining visible. And that smaller lake became inactive at 3 on June 3rd. Therefore, with the last week blasts occurring at 6 p.m. on the 3rd, 3.5-day eruption. But really, it was all about those first really 2 hours. So I think if I come down past this segment of lava here, we can get radioactivity they're describing back then. And so here we go to the conclusions. So the final volume left was only 1/12 of that extruded in 52, but the rate of lava outburst in the first few hours was very high, equal to the first part of a 52 eruption. It was at that point one of the shortest on record, even at 3.5 days. And they talk about how it was unique to have it see the fissure come across that 3D structure coming down. We come past all of this here, Kīlauea, 72. They're concerned about lava erupting on the crater floor for the first time in 30 years and how that's aligning with the East Rift connection to Magma, which is something they hadn't seen since the 1800s. So that is all the details there of that eruption. And one thing I thought was interesting was these authors actually spoke with Isabel Jagger. And what they were talking about at the time was how these last eruptions in 52 and 54 were much different in character than the previous era they had been used to, in the 1920s, of lava lakes and overflows and always having an open vent with lava coming up all the time, and how that had changed. And now Kilauea was actually resembling more what Mauna Loa actually did there. So that's a little recap on 54. USGS also has a Volcano Watch article from 2011 going back that summarizes some of this, not with all of that detail in there, but ultimately, most of that lava poured out in the first 2 hours, and the rest of it was just a wind down. And so if that were to happen again today, it would be a pretty quick scramble, and we'd see it winding down within the first few hours as well on the webcams. And speaking of today, we have seen that the last few eruptions have gotten shorter and shorter in duration. So our September eruption was only a week long. The one before that was 2 weeks long. So we might be coming up to a half-week long eruption, perhaps. And so that's something that certainly is possible. And as we've been saying previously, the most likely place for an eruption is still the main caldera in Haleʻiʻaʻu. So while we're commemorating this anniversary of the 54 eruption, which in 2024, it's been 70 years, we can also look at the parallels and say, well, perhaps the seismic unrest that we're seeing in Kilauea now might lead to an eruption that might be similar in its duration and in its vigor and its characteristics as we saw in 54. So, all right, stop there and we can take our break, Dane. I'll pass it to you for our thank yous and questions and all of that other good stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, let's maybe do questions first and then we'll do thank yous afterwards. Does that work for you?
Sure.
All right, we got a couple questions here from Nicholas. First one is what conditions are needed for a pit crater on Kilauea? So
that's a great question, Nicholas. I think the thing that most of us who know the history of the pit craters in Kilauea think of is how that newest crater that's called Devil's Throat, and that's where you know it's new. It doesn't have an older Hawaiian name. It's got a more missionary influence name, we'll say, right? Devil's Throat, that formed in the early 1900s, and it began as a small opening, maybe 6 feet wide on the surface. And then it was kind of pear-shaped. Someone rappelled into it and saw it was wider at the bottom, and it was kind of collapsing its way upwards, and eventually the top widened to be vertical walls from being more of a pear-shaped originally, something like that. So it seems like the pit craters grow from the bottom up, is what that basically tells us, and that we can we can try to understand that by understanding the magma is being stored from the rift zone in pockets along the rift zone down below where the pit craters are forming. So it's thought to be something like you have a pocket of magma coming into an area and filling an area. That's your step one. And when that happens, you might see extra heat at the surface, steam, gas release, gas vents, mineral deposits. There is an area on South Kilauea Caldera now, the Puhimau thermal area, that has a kind of characteristic where lots of the trees are dying. You only see grasses there and lots of crunchy yellow ground, sulfur mixed into the dirt there. That's like an area where magma has come and filled an area and is stored in a pocket. That's your part one. And then part two, some things that have changed to actually flush that out and allow it to go somewhere else. So let's say the rift zone opens, there's a big earthquake, and that thing's able to drain somehow. And if that happens, then you have a void in the ground, and then that void starts to collapse upwards, and then you get to your pear shape, and then you get to your hole in the surface, and then you get to your pit crater eventually. So that's how I will leave that. And yeah,
right.
Very general, and might be more nuanced than that potentially, right? But that's.
We'll do one more from Nicholas. Yes. Did Kilauea lose an upper magma chamber in 1790 and in 1924 and never recovered the lost magma?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I can really answer that, or maybe with some research into some of the chemistry, we can get to what the most up-to-date knowledge is. But 24 is still a big mystery. If you caught the clips that we showed of Don a few weeks ago, Don Swanson, as After Dark in the Park, he talks about how there is lots of unanswered questions about that 24 eruption. Where did the magma actually go in that intrusion in April? And rethinking whether it was groundwater moving into the collapse pit that caused those explosions, or whether it was arrival of some newer magma that was perhaps more gas rich or more viscous, that could trap more gas, something like that. Yeah, so maybe let me take a peek at the question again there. Yeah, 1790 is even harder, right? Because we just have the explosive remains to look at and to investigate from. So it does seem quite possible to me. The 1790 explosive eruption was quite a bit larger, right? And so it does seem likely that whatever was an uppermost chamber could have easily been compromised, right?
Right.
And we don't really know what any of these chambers, we call them chambers or reservoirs sometimes, this network of storage areas in the summit of the volcano. We don't know how many and how they're distributed, and whether thinking of them as chambers is really the most useful way to do it, and how they might form and all of that. And so reflecting on what we see now, these 4 eruptions in 5 years we've had at the summit, and we now have this magma body cooling at the surface. It's going to have this gooey center in it, and perhaps that could be a future magma storage zone. That could be the uppermost chamber, and if you had one that's that shallow, it certainly would be destroyed in a 24 or 1790 situation, right? We heard that the calculations from the scientists about the collapse in 2018 suggests that it was no more than 10% of the magma chamber that was emptied.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
So there must be some larger pocket of it further down, and depending on whether the crater is mostly empty, that I'll call it middle one now, could be at the very top, or it could be the second one down, depending on how the crater is configured at any moment in time. And so now it gets really tricky to even talk about what are we talking about, and what is a chamber, and how does it influence the signals from those different depths and stacked on each other. And so that gets pretty messy in there. So yeah, those are great questions, Nicholas. Yeah, I don't have answers, but I'd like to just have a little discussion about it there. That's
All right.
what I can add.
All right. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and do some thank yous. So for that, I will bring on Lou. Phil will be back here in a moment. Hey, Lou, how are you doing?
I'm good. How you doing?
All right. Just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in today. You know, we rely on the likes, subscriptions, and the shares to help get this out there. It helps with the algorithms. You know, you hear about it a bunch, but it does get it out there in front of more eyes, so more people can find this type of content as opposed to maybe the more flamboyant content. So we thank you for that. And we'd also like to thank our donators. This is a small list of all the people that have supported us over the past few months. So we appreciate everybody for their continued support as well.
That's right. You can always donate at hveri.org/donate anytime. There we go.
Yeah, all for your support.
Also, you did mention Puna Strong and Kilauea Recover Grant. That was at the top of the list there, as well as everybody that's donated this year, including the fundraiser drive that we had in March. So thank you, everybody.
Yep. Yeah, definitely thank Puna Strong and the Kilauea Recovery Grant for keeping this whole shindig going. All right. Well, I think we can get into the next section. Thank you, Lou, for jumping on. All right. And there we go. We're back.
All right, Dane. Well, it is still 6th-year anniversary of 2018. And you have lined up for us this compilation of that first week of the, well, not the first week. What is this, the fourth week, or is it the third week? Somewhere in there, right? This last week of May of the eruption.
Beginning of the fourth week, I believe.
Yeah, so I'll let you take it from here.
Right. So this begins just before Hell Night. And for the context of what's going on here, we've 4 weeks into the eruption at this point, and it's starting to migrate back up rift. And as it does so, it's getting progressively more hot and fluid, producing larger lava flows that reach further down slope. So everything is escalating at this point, and it's escalating every day, sometimes hour by hour. So this is really the apex, or the peak of the drama that was going on, and all of the evacuations and things happening in the middle of the night. This was it. And then a lot of what happens later all is set up by this sequence here. So this is really the heaviest part of the eruption that we're going to be going through.
Yeah, and so let me just say that we do have on our YouTube channel, I'm going to show you guys, there's a whole drones on playlist day by day here going through. Towards the end of the eruption, it ends up being a couple days or a whole week when things don't really change for many days at a time. So there are 32 videos here. They're mostly in the range of 5 to 10 minutes, somewhere in there. And we're just going to share with you guys a little excerpt of the last part of May with you guys today.
Right.
So yeah, if you're ready.
All right, let's do it.
We'll play it, and yeah, great job with this thing.
21 and 7 continues to advance to the north.
Yeah, go ahead. We get right into it. So
yeah,
here we go.
Let's do it.
Encroaching upon the Puna geothermal venture. Meanwhile, Fissure 8 is reactivating with intermittent activity. It's not very vigorous, but it is there. It is turning back on throughout the night. Early morning on the 26th, we see that the lava flow from Fissure 7 and Fissure 21 is yet to cross the Pohoiki Road. We also have the activity just uprift of it to the right, that's Fissure 8, as well as activity further downrift, which is still feeding the ocean entries. At this point in time, there's still 2 of them. So in Leilani Estates, we have a decent amount of people that are viewing the lava. By this point in time, the placard system has been in effect, and to get into Leilani Estates, you have to show proof of residency in some capacity. So there's not a ton of people crawling around, but even the people that are there, some of them are getting ticketed by the police for parking and other weird little nuanced ways to basically keep people from going and looking at the lava. And even if you took 10-15 minutes while you're evacuating to go do it, you might get ticketed for it. At the same time, the media is being brought in and given special access in many ways to certain spots where they can take video and record to run on the news. It's really weird because at the same time that it's overzealous against very specific residents, it's laissez-faire against others. And we just have to deal with it as things transition at this point in the eruption into the reign of Fissure 8. This video is taken from one of the homes that is on Pohoiki Road with a large lava flow advancing to the north. And this lava flow is going to continue advancing throughout the day. Activity on the 26th is mostly consistent. We do have some activity emerging at Fissure 8 with some light spatter. It's not producing a large lava flow at this point, but it still gives a sense that lava is transitioning further up the rift. And I remember this point in the eruption clearly because I was thinking that the lava is coming from the mid part of Leilani Estates that is yet untouched by the lava flows. And that's where my home is. So we were evacuating everything that wasn't nailed down. Mostly because of the lava, but also because of looters. There were people going around looting in Leilani Estates, as well as other neighborhoods around the eruption site, taking advantage of people in their time of need. And that was, heartbreaking in and of itself, but it was also part of the reason why the placard system and the police presence was being implemented in Leilani Estates. Transitioning into May 27th, we see the lava flow that was coming from Fissure 21 and 7 cross Pohoiki Road roughly 4 p.m. the previous day, and has been slowly encroaching upon the Puna geothermal venture. Now the power plant is slightly elevated from its surrounding. It's positioned on a very old cinder cone, and it is slightly protected in that regard, so that lava isn't just rushing onto the property and inundating it like some other areas. This aerial footage from Mick Kalber on his morning overflight shows something else with the lava flow that's moving towards PGV, and that's how it's being what appears to be constrained by the previous eruptive vents cutting across Pohoiki Road. At the time, I was thinking that the lava flow was trying to wrap around the Kahukai Kipuka, this elevated hill that is now just a small island of untouched land, and it's trying to wrap around that, but instead hit the barrier and started pooling and then encroaching upon PGV, moving slightly uphill. Lava continued to accumulate on the southern end of the power plant and encroach further and further in, claiming a couple wells, covering them entirely, as well as evaporating this pool of water being stored near the well pads. If we look here at Fissure 7 and Fissure 21 with Fissure 8 behind it, we have this large amount of lava that is accumulating and ponding around the bases, feeding lava flows that are slowly moving to the east and the flow that's moving to the north. There's just a large amount of lava here, and you can see just how much the ground has risen up from the previous elevations. It's probably like 40 to 50 feet deep already, the thickness of the lava on top of the old land. This video from USGS shows Fissure 7, which is probably the most active fissures across these 2 days, until we go into the night of May 27th when Fissure 8 reactivates and Fissure 23 turns on as well, a night that we would call Hell Night. The night that would change the course of the eruption and how it was perceived by the people on the ground, as well as the authorities that were trying to oversee the ongoing disaster. As the night came on the 27th, hell was truly unleashed upon Leilani Estates. Fissure 8 and Fissure 23 started putting down new lava flows that were fast moving. One of the biggest, most voluminous parts of the eruption that we've seen so far happens in part of the neighborhood that has yet to be covered by lava. There's going to be dozens and dozens of homes lost this night. We see here as lava is moving down Luana Street, and this is a common occurrence that we've seen throughout the eruption. Lava takes the path of least resistance, and usually that ends up being a road. To the north of Fissure 23, in the path of the lava flow, there was a large ground crack that predated the eruption. Now, these types of cracks are fairly common throughout Leilani Estates. It is in the rift zone, and the ground has the trademarks of previous volcanic eruptions. This is one of them. And lava began pouring into the ground crack at roughly late afternoon and began filling it up. By 10 p.m., the lava coming from Fissure 23 pouring into the ground crack had almost filled it entirely. It would overtop the ground crack in the coming hours. As the activity, though, at Fissure 23 waned away, the ground crack began draining the lava within it. Eventually, all of the lava within it would be drained back somewhere into the earth. This is what it looked like that night on the ground. This is the scene as hell swept through the subdivision. This was the first night that I had heard the mayor come over the airwaves on the scanner and started issuing orders directly to first responders. And they were in a rough position because many of the guys that were being tasked with going into the subdivision in the parts that were about to be inundated weren't familiar with the area. These are cops that have been brought in on overtime from other parts of the island to assist. They're the ones that were going in. So there was a great deal of unknowns for them, that they were just in an unfamiliar area with an absolutely chaotic scene happening. And there is some additional stories that come about from that. One story that night that Hawaii Tractor was directly involved in focused on a man on Luana Street that became somewhat trapped by the lava flows and had to escape through the jungle to try and get out of the way of the lava. Now, we started calling the neighbors that we know in Leilani Estates that were downslope of the lava flow and telling them what was happening. And he really didn't believe us. He was skeptical and stubborn and basically waited until the lava had cut across his driveway and taken out his easiest ways out of his property. So then he calls the authorities, who then bring in a drone team to assist, and they end up guiding him out of the subdivision while he's sitting there on the phone talking to the dispatcher. The dispatcher's relaying the messages to the drone team and the first responders on the ground. It really was a chaotic scene.
So following Hell Night on May 27th, this was the scene that many people awoke to. Early in the morning, Fissure 24 is still active and putting down a lava flow that's going into the mouth of Fissure 8. This would become the well-defined cinder cone, 200 feet tall, and the well-pronounced lava channel that we're all too familiar with. This is what it looked like before Fissure 8 turned on and stayed on. While the majority of the lava erupted in Hell Night on May 27th did go to the north, a good amount of it pancaked around the base of Fissure 8 and expanded the flanks on the south side of the flow, claiming several houses in the process. But an entire street here is lost in the night. Dozens of homes gone. And just look how wide this flow is about to show. The profile of it is humongous. The lava you see here, this is all fresh stuff. All erupted overnight. Just a huge amount of lava taking out so many homes, so much property taken. So many memories buried, heirlooms lost, and who knows what else. So coming into view on the left is a bunch of really large trees poking out of the lava.
These are albizia trees. Some of them are roughly 100 foot tall, but it gives a really good example of how lava tree molds are made. The lava will come in, surround the trees, but the trees don't burn away right away. So as the lava hardens, the tree burns, but the lava preserves a mold into the flow field of what that tree once was. Now these albizia tree molds are kind of interesting. I don't think that many of these have been made into lava tree molds before. These are relatively new invasive species that have spread over the last several decades, and the last eruption in this area was 1955 and 1960. So these tree molds are really unique, to me at least, in just how large and how intricate they are. Now progressing on into the early afternoon, this video shows a really cool little vortex, a bunch of gas caught in an updraft off of the flow field. And these were relatively common during the eruption. The hard part was capturing them. It felt like every time somebody would see one, by the time they got a camera out or the phone out, it was gone. Kind of just like that. Now you can see a lot of this flow is hardened up. There's not a lot of lava getting fed into the flow front at this point in time, but that's soon about to change. So now you're looking at the Kahukaikipuka again, and Fissure 13 still active. And then the camera pans looking up the rift zone, back towards Fissure 8. But we're looking across a dozen other fissures before we get there. Many of these ones have been buried by larger lava flows after they erupted initially. So you can see where the steam and the gas is coming out. That's where a lot of these fissures were. So coming into view now is Fissure 7, active once again. There's a good amount of lava coming out of those vents, but there isn't a very significant lava flow, which is curious in that it either just started erupting again or there's something more at play. And we're about to see that in a minute as to what that is. But we're kind of in a ping pong right here between the fissures as everything starts to centralize at Fissure 8. So these are the hours leading into the full reactivation of Fissure 8. So we're going to be doing a flyby of Fissure 7 here, but you can see how the fresh lava has a different coloration than the stuff that's dried already. The fresh stuff is still gray, whereas everything a little bit older has more of a dark coloration to it. Speaking of coloration, if you look on the left hand side, you'll see all the vegetation is brown. It's been cooked by the gas emissions, which have been pushed that direction by the predominant wind patterns, and it has done a number in that area. On the eastern side, on the north side, it's not so bad, but on the south side, it has really done a number. As we pass over Fissure 8, you can see it's not active currently, and we're going to go uprift a little ways and see Fissure 24 also has ceased erupting at this point in the mid-afternoon. And now we're coming up to Fissure 24. The thing that stands out to me on Fissure 24 right here is just how much of a cinder cone it was able to build overnight. It's pretty significant, and there had been a good amount of lava coming out of that thing. This video started off with a shot of Fissure 24, and at that point in the early morning it was still pumping. Now this is mid-afternoon, and all you can see in it is a little bit of a glow. Fissure 8, not a lot of action there. Fissure 7's going. But let's take a little bit of a closer look at Fissure 7. Coming into view is part of the reason why Fissure 7 wasn't putting out a big lava flow. You can see two eruptive vents, but then a third one that's draining lava back underground. The drone is taking off from Leilani Avenue, looking immediately at Fissure 7, which is still active back there, hidden behind all the fog. But coming in the view on the right, that's a reactivated Fissure 8. And you can already see that gray lava that it's been able to start channeling towards the north in what would become the Fissure 8 lava channel. It's still kind of pancaking around the area. It's still in its early stages. But activity is beginning to centralize around it. We're panning to the right, looking at Fissure 24. Not seeing a whole lot other than gas going through the neighborhood, and that is not a good wind pattern for Leilani Estates. That is going to be nasty to be in there at that point. It's dusk now. We're a couple miles away from Fissure 8 in this shot. You can see just how tall those fountains are. These things got big quickly. 8 p.m. in the shot.
Fissure 8 has fully reactivated and is putting down a rather immense lava flow. The flow is going over much of the same area that was covered on May 27th in Hell Night, but it's also going off of that area and extending the flanks in certain spots, taking more houses when it does it. But it's just a huge amount of lava coming out right now. And thus began the reign of Fissure 8. This one fissure would put out more lava than the rest of the eruptive vents combined over the course of the eruption. It truly was a sight to behold. Even with the destruction, the pain, and all of that mixed in, just seeing it was awe-inspiring. There was so much lava coming out of this thing that's really hard to put into words. Just think of dozens and dozens of Olympic-sized swimming pools just coming out in the biggest fountain that you've ever seen, all in a matter of seconds, and doing it over and over and over for weeks without interruption. The rest of the vents, they kind of bounced around. They'd have their moment in the sun, and then they'd calm down. Fissure 8 wasn't having none of it. Fissure 8 was going to go until Fissure 8 was done. And when it finished, it would be known as Ahu'aila'au, the altar of the forest eater.
Down Leilani Boulevard, probably halfway to Kapona. Oh.
What hit the camera there was a piece of reticulite. This is a very gas-rich, foamy piece of rock that was erupted from the volcano, erupted from Fissure 8, carried on the wind, and as it did, all of the gas escaped it, so you're left with a rock that's mostly air. I'm gonna have to grab a piece just to show you. 1 second. All right, I got two pieces of it. One right here. You can see it looks like a normal rock, but there is just a ton of little gas pockets, all these little cells in it. And then a little one here. I want to show just how brittle this rock is. So just with these two fingers, right, this rock breaks into nothing. And you could break it all the way down to dust. Same with this one here. This is a USGS thermal map from the afternoon of May 28th, and in it you can see the reactivation of Fissure 8, this lava flow that's moving to the north towards Poʻiki Road, as well as the reactivation of Fissure 18 and Fissure 22. The ocean entry at this point has diminished significantly. Throughout the night, Fissure 8 remained extremely active with these 200-foot tall fountains. This lava flow is still ponding, it's still spreading out in multiple directions, but primarily moving to the north, where it has crossed Poʻiki Road and started to move onto the property of the Puna Geothermal Venture towards Highway 132. From the ground, the site of the eruption is incredibly impressive at Fissure 8. While the fountain isn't exceedingly tall, 200 feet, isn't a very large fountain for Kilauea, it's just a huge amount of volume. It's almost unimaginable. And this lava flow is primarily moving to the north, and it's about to raise some questions about where is it going to try and go. To understand the difficulties in projecting where the lava flow is heading, we need to look at this one map here from USGS that shows the paths of steepest descent, the blue lines, and we need to focus on the blue line just to the left of PGV. Now this blue line here has it cutting across Highway 132 to give the path that is most likely for the lava to take. The issue is these paths of steepest descent lines don't really indicate where the area is flat, and where the area is flat is where things can go off course. When there's some slope to it, then these lines are pretty accurate, but when it's flat, they kind of don't capture the complexities of that area. Here we see the distal tip of the lava flow coming from Fissure 8, and it is currently on the Puna Geothermal Venture property. It's cutting across this cane field as it makes its way towards Highway 132. We fast forward a little bit later that same day. We see that the lava flow we were just looking at has fanned out across the area that would be considered flat. It's also crossed Highway 132 to the north, but there's a significant amount of lava looking like it's moving to the east, wrapping around the Puna Geothermal Venture. Not to be entirely overshadowed, Fissure 18 is also putting down a rather significant lava flow that day. It's moving straight towards the Ahalanui Warm Ponds from the Halakamaina area and it's progressing about 1.5 miles a day. It ends up getting within a half mile of the Warren Ponds and Highway 137 before stopping. In addition to trying to figure out where the lava flow is going, there's also the question of what happens if the activity tries to shift even further up the rift zone. There's no guarantee at this point in time that activity is going to stay at Fissure 8. It has been active all night for the past couple days, and it doesn't look like it's going to let up, but we've seen how these fissure eruptions have been progressing up the line, up the rift zone for the past week and a half. In the morning overflight from McCalver, we see Fissure 8 still pumping. And this time is about where the transition into the next phase of the eruption begins. A phase with even hotter, fresher magma, most likely from the summit itself, has made its way down into the rift zone and is being erupted into the subdivision of Leilani Estates. Now this lava is just so much hotter than the stuff that we've seen before. The eruption is now in its height. This is the phase that is the apex of activity for the 2018 eruption. Here we are back at the flat area we were looking at the previous day, and we see that the lava flow from Fissure 8 has started to separate into several different fingers. Now these fingers are trying to make their way down to the ocean independently of each other, but by separating the lava flow into so many tips, it has slowed the advancement of the flow as a whole. Most of these fingers that have separated from the main lava flow are moving to the north, including one that's on that path of steepest descent that we were previously looking at. But the primary lava flow has been moving down Highway 132 on the road, running parallel to the road, until it kicks off near the Noni Farms Road and starts making its way to the jungle. The thing is the path of steepest descent from here takes it to Kapoho. At this point, there's a new question about the evacuation of Kapoho and when should it be called, or at least advised of the potential for there being an evacuation. From here, the lava flow really only has one path down, and that takes it through the coastal community. But the rate of advancement is volatile. It's fluctuating between fast movements in steeper areas where it's moving at roughly 0.5 miles an hour to flatter spots where it stalls out and reduces down to only a couple hundred feet an hour. The previous evening on May 29th, there was a community meeting with the authorities and the community to discuss the ongoing eruption. And we expected at this point for the authorities to make it clear to Kapoho residents that they should begin the evacuation process. Instead, nothing was really said. It was kind of kept on the low. And with each passing hour, Hawaii Tractor, we were becoming more and more concerned. Les Pedersen at this point in time puts out on the night of the 30th an evacuation notice on behalf of Hawaii Tracker, telling the Kapoho residents to begin that process now. We didn't wait for the authorities to make that call. An hour and a half later, at 1:30 in the morning on May 31st, the authorities finally pulled the trigger and began a pitch black evacuation procedure that was pretty wild considering the amount of time that we had prior to that and the rates of advancement we were seeing that night. The operations that night also created issues for the first responders and Hawaii Police Department that were tasked with going into the areas just upslope of Kapoho in order to notify residents as well as monitor the ongoing lava flows. The thing is that a lot of the officers that were going into these areas, into these farmlands, into these papaya fields, were not familiar with the area. Going at night, it's a very easy way to get lost. And that's exactly what happened. One officer went in without cell phone reception, without good radio reception, got lost, finally got cell reception, put in a call for backup. A second unit went in to retrieve them, got lost themselves, put in an additional request for backup, and finally a cop that was familiar with the area went in to retrieve both of them. And that just highlights some of the complexities that issuing an evacuation order in the middle of the night presents itself.
Yeah,
All
it
right.
was interesting times. A lot happened in the short span of time. It doesn't even capture, everything that's happening behind the scenes, especially with people.
No, I mean, really, every day was what, 18, 20 hours, 22 hours sometimes. And you got it down to 5 or 10 minutes each one, but which is still capturing a lot of it. But yeah, there's a lot that you've had to gloss over just to get to that, because it would take 3 months otherwise. It'd take 3 months.
Right. Back when we were doing this, I was doing an episode every week, so there wasn't a huge amount of production time to get the next turn, to get a new episode turned around and put out.
Right. Yeah, it was awesome that you did it when it was still fresh, and now it's documented day by day. I think it's one of the best records day by day that there is out here that I've seen, actually. Yeah, especially in that format. So yeah,
right.
Yeah.
In a decade, I'm like hoping, it finds value for people that are trying to figure out what it was like when they're looking at it, to see what it was really like, instead of just, the USGS summary or the after action report from civil defense. It's like, what was it like on the ground, though, for the people that were doing it at the time?
Right. Yeah, I do think it does come through, right? It gets pretty intense in there, and if you were there, then it can certainly be triggering, and we understand that, but that's part of the healing process too, and it's the reason why we're doing what we're doing, right? That's what gives us our mission, to try to improve our disaster preparedness, response, and recovery, all of it because of this event that changed the course of our lives here.
Right.
So yeah, it's only right that we honor it here on the 6-year anniversary of that crazy week. And yeah, I guess we'll figure out if we'll do more of these in the future here over the summer. But I suspect you might see some of these again. We'll see.
Yeah. All right.
Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up and put a bow on it here?
Yeah, I think maybe just the stuff we got going on this Saturday. We want to talk about that real quick.
So let's come to our community corner, and let's put that here on the screen. This Saturday, we have the Civil Defense Preparedness Fair happening at the Fukushima Civic Center in Hilo, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m.
For those that don't maybe recognize the name, that's where Merry Monarch is held. Right. Everybody knows where that's held if you live in Hilo.
Yeah, so they'll have all different kind of tables and organizations representing there. We will be there ourselves with a table. Learn how to get your community and home prepared. KKID services, door prizes and giveaways, food information vendors, live broadcasts on the radio, interactive games. That's a civil defense poster. And they also have a little more right up at the Pacific Tsunami Museum site. This fair is to raise community awareness about disaster preparedness, emergency response, and community resilience. Learn about the hazards in your area, what you're most susceptible to, and how you can better prepare yourself in the event of an emergency. There will be a wide variety of partners at the fair, ranging from local county entities to federal agencies, all with a common goal of informing the public on disasters as it pertains to their role. So learn about how the USGS Hawaiian Volcano Observatory tracks volcanic activity, how Pacific Tsunami Warning Center tracks tsunamis, how National Weather Service tracks cyclones, and much more, how to create an evacuation kit, how to build your own family plan, cater to your needs, and enhance your community resilience. So all that stuff, meet people face to face, and Pacific Tsunami Museum Director Cindy Preller will be the keynote speaker. So it'll be a handful of events, of which Cindy Preller is one.
Right.
What do you have to say about that, Dane?
Keynote speaker. Yeah, there's 6 speakers that are going to be speaking, starting at 9 a.m., beginning with civil defense themselves. Talmadge Magna will give a quick summary, maybe 15 minutes or so. Then at 10 a.m., we have Cindy here from the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, or Tsunami Museum, sorry. And then we have Ken Hahn with USGS HVO at 10:30. And then the all hazards home preparation at 11:45. And Pacific Tsunami, or the Hurricane National Weather Service will be there to give a 2024 hurricane season update. And finally, Firewise will be there for the final presentation at 1:30 to talk about fire prevention, fire mitigation, what we learned from Maui, all of those types of things. So definitely, if you're interested in those types, that would be in the Butler building. That's the building, the back left, a little bit north of the Civic Center itself. It's where a lot of the vendors go for Merry Monarch. Yeah, and come check us out. We've been helping Civil Defense prepare for this one. It's our first time with Civil Defense sitting down weekly to be able to help organize and plan and come up with the logistics. So yeah, it's a big event. A lot of different, I think there's 40 different, over 40, maybe 45 different organizations coming. Food trucks are going to be there. We have the presentation. So it's kind of a whole package that's happening.
Yeah, awesome. We're looking forward to seeing anyone who can come out and say hi to us. And we might have some little props to start rolling out. So come check us out.
Yep.
And
we will have a table there. Yep.
And so, yeah, one last thing in our community corner. In the national park, there are still some events occurring. And just within the next week, I will highlight that on Tuesday, June 4th, 7 p.m., will be a After Dark in a Park presentation by a PhD from UH Manoa Anthropology on the Hawaiian field systems of Ka'u. This is a huge archaeological, agricultural discovery of recent years, and it'd be pretty cool to see what that's all about. So that's what's coming up in the next week, and then we'll come back to our community events following that. So that is it from my end, Dane, for our community events.
Yeah. All right. I think do we have another thing to do for outro, or?
Yeah, I think we're going to roll our thank yous once again on the way out. And
all right.
Play our outro, but anything else before we push the button?
No, I think that's it for me. Until next week, unless something happens, 5 p.m. on Thursdays, our standard time. If something does happen, we'll come on air and cover that. Not really expected, but hey, you never know.
Yeah, mahalo, Dane. Thanks for all your work this week. And mahalo to our ASL interpreters, Dano and Rachel. Mahalo, you guys. Hopefully it was not too hard to keep up with that video. We know it can be challenging when we record stuff without that in mind.
Sorry
as
about
was the case many years ago. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you, everybody. And if we don't see you on Saturday, we'll see you again next week. And until then, from HVERI, Hawaiian Volcano Education, Resilience Institute, I'm Philip Ong, Dane DuPont. Aloha, everyone.